Discovering New England History, and we're going to continue on with our episodes on Lizzie Borden. And this will be part 3, and we'll begin with slide number 1. Okay, and of course that's the famous Lizzie Borden house where all the murders were committed on 92 2nd Street in Fall River. And we'll go to slide number 2. Now, present at the murder scene, there were really only two women present, Lizzie Borden and Bridget Sullivan, who was the maid. So we're going to go through here different alibis that they offered to the Fall River police. So there's really only 2 here at the murder scene. And we'll go to the next slide. And John Morse, who was Lizzie's uncle, of course, he came unannounced and he stayed over the night before, then he left after breakfast in the morning, so he wasn't there. He took a trolley trip downtown to Fall River to visit one of his other cousins, I believe, and he had witnesses, and so that's basically his alibi. He wasn't there when the murders were committed. And we'll go to the next slide. Bridget Sullivan, she was the maid. Now, when Abby was actually murdered, she claims that she was, and she was, outside washing all the windows. And when the father was murdered, it was a little bit different there. She was upstairs on the 3rd floor taking a nap after working outside washing all the windows. And they basically said she really didn't have a motive because she we're just a maid there. So they discounted that. So basically, we'll go to the next slide. And Emma Borden, her sister. Now, it was interesting, when John Moore stayed over the night before, then Emma left. And she went to Fairhaven, Massachusetts. So she wasn't there at all. And she stayed at a distant cousin's house, the Brownell House, Fairhaven, Massachusetts. And that's actually a postcard. That's a picture of the street in Fairhaven. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, I found this one here. This is the Brownell House in Fairhaven. Now, this looks really good. Nice house, all nice and landscaped and everything, pretty much all cleaned up, well painted and preserved. This was taken quite a few years ago. And that's the house where she stayed. And it's, I guess, one of the famous houses in, over in Fairhaven. Now, today, whoever owned it, they just let it go and totally abandoned it, and it's in disrepair. So the next slide, you can see what it looks like today. It's completely overgrown. All the windows are, some are smashed in, whatever, and they just let it go. With no explanation. So that's the Brownell house where Lizzie's sister, of course she was her 10 years older than Lizzie, where she went. And we'll go to the next slide. And of course Lizzie's alibi, she stated that when her mother was killed, she was inside in the kitchen, probably doing ironing. And when her father was killed, she stated she was in the backyard barn looking for lead sinkers, getting ready to go for a fishing trip. And we'll go to the next slide. And this is a very interesting one. This just came out recently, a newspaper that I got from Somerset, 1997, had the story of Ellen Egan. That's how they spell her name, E-L-L-A-N. And she was a neighbor, and the night of the murders, or the day of the murder, she came walking down the street. I guess she had an appointment somewhere in downtown Fall River, and she noticed a man coming out of the house, and she heard the bells ringing, whether it was from a church or City Hall. They always rang at 11 o'clock, and that, according to coroner, whatever, was the time when Andrew Borden was killed. And this gentleman came out of the house, and he was carrying something in a burlap bag, and he had a wagon with him. And he got in there, and he went down the street. She bumped into him there, and he recognized him as William Borden. And he's going to be interesting. Well, we'll develop his character a little bit. He was the illegitimate son of Andrew Borden. So Ellen Egan, she's something new that developed here just recently. So we'll go to the next picture. And William Borden. And I looked him up, and basically he was called in Fall River a horse renderer. And I said, what in the world's a horse renderer? And every town in, I guess back in the day, they all had horses, and it was rural, they all had cattle. And he was a gentleman that was hired when they had hoof and mouth disease, and they got, and the horses were getting old, whatever, they would call William Borden, and he would have his wagon, and he always kept an axe underneath the front seat of his wagon, and he always would come down and he would use that to kill either the horses or the cows, and then he would take them away and dispose of them. And that was his job. This is going to be another important part of the story. He was actually trained as a butcher, and this just came out recently, and it's an interesting part of the story here. So we'll go to the next slide. And now, after the inquest in Fall River, they decided they had enough to arrest Lizzie Borden. So they arrested Lizzie August 11th, 1892. And there's the police marshal of Fall River. She's the only one that had motive, the only one that was in the house at the time, in that general area. And they figured that she was, of course, she hated her stepmother, and she was the only one they could actually say that committed the crime. So we'll go to the next slide. And then Lizzie was jailed, and where she was jailed was the Central Police Station in Fall River. And that's an old picture of what it looked like. And they did not have really accommodations for women in the jail, and that was the problem to keep her locked up. And of course, on the second floor of the jail was the impromptu courtroom, if you will, where they had the inquest and decided they had enough evidence to prosecute. So we'll go to the next slide. And what happened here, the Fall River police, once they arrested her, they felt that the investigation was over, and Lizzie Borden was taken in custody. And I really like this picture. At that time, when the investigation was over, there's a picture of the Fall River Police Department, and they're photographed in front of the armory in Fall River, which is still there today. That's the picture on the right. And you can see it's an important part of history of Fall River. This was, of course, in 1892. So they just declared the investigation over. They got Lizzie, they got enough evidence they felt to bring her to trial, and there's no use to look for any other potential killer. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, Ellen Egan, she was one of the neighbors a couple blocks down the street, and she was very quiet, and she said to her husband, I was here, and I saw William Borden come out of the house right at 11 o'clock, and she said, that's really on the time of where the murders occurred, and I want to go to the police and tell them about that. And her husband said, well, you really don't want to do that. He said, it looks like the investigation is over. And she said, well, I'm going to do that. So according to the record, she went to the police in Fall River, and they sat down with her, and they took all her information down. And they said, well, we've already basically concluded the investigation. And they told her, what you saw, don't ever tell anyone else you saw William Borden come out of the house at 11 o'clock. and she didn't know really what to say. She was very kind of a quiet person, so she left. And they say years afterwards, there were no records. The police never kept any records of her actually sitting down and what she told them. And you got to remember at the time, the city of Fall River, they wanted to capture whoever did those two murders. You've got a murderer on the loose. The whole city was under a lot of tension about that. And there was a lot of urgency for the police to solve the crime, get it squared away, tell the people we've got the person that did it, and then they can, life moves on. So they didn't want to hear about Ellen's testimony at all. So we'll go to the next picture. Now, they didn't really have the facilities there to keep Lizzie. So they transported her. She went from the jail to the Fall River Railroad Station, and that's a picture of the railroad station back in 1892. You can see all the horses and carriages there, and of course the train would come in on the other side of this building right here. And she was going to get transported to Taunton, Massachusetts. So we'll go to the next picture. And that's an old Colony Railroad train. That's typical of the type in the very early or late 1800s. And they put her on the train, under guard, of course, and they transported her 10 miles north from Fall River to the Taunton jail. And we'll go to the next slide. And I put this map together just to see where we're going here. Fall River, you can see on the left side of the drawing right here. And then 10 miles north, they took Lizzie by train up to Taunton, Massachusetts, just to give you a relative idea of what's going on here. They really didn't have the facility in Fall River to keep her in jail for awaiting trial, which could be a long period of time. So we'll go to the next slide. And this picture here I got, it's the Taunton Railroad Station. So the train arrived in Taunton, and there's the railroad station. And of course, Lizzie got out and she was escorted by the police. And we'll go to the next picture. And they went to, this is in Taunton, the Hodges Jail. And she actually had to stay there for 10 months. They had her incarcerated for 10 months. All the proceedings with the trial, everything, getting the case ready and whatever, it actually ended up taking 10 months that she was in this jail. But they treated her very well there, and she was allowed to have visitors, and that's where she stayed. And that jail is no longer there. They had a fire, and that was all burnt down. I believe now it's the site of a nursing home right now. So we'll go to the next slide. And right down the street from that jail, I mean, no more than a quarter of a mile, was what they call it back at the time. Today we would call it a Taunton hospital. And back in the day, they called it a Taunton Insane Asylum. And this is really interesting. There's a picture of it in the middle. William Borden now, of course, who was the, related to Andrew Borden, illegitimate son. And he was always knocking on the door in 92 2nd Street, always trying to meet with Andrew and say, look, I want to make sure I'm honored in your will. I'm your illegitimate son. And he was telling people around town that he's got a famous father, a wealthy father, and he always wanted to make sure he got his fair share of the extreme wealth that Mr. Borden had. But he was a very unstable person, and it is documented that he was in and out of this Taunton Insane Asylum all the time. Very unstable. He would have aggressive tendencies, and of course he went around as a horse renderer with his axe underneath the wagon. Now Lizzie Borden, she claimed that when she was transported to the Taunton jail, she claimed that they had her for a week at this Taunton Insane Asylum for psychiatric evaluation, which makes sense. That's probably another reason why they shipped her from Fall River up to Taunton. It's right next to the Taunton Insane Asylum. But there's no records of it. So a lot of historians are discounting that, what she said. But back in the day, it's certainly questionable how good all these record keeping were. So we'll never know. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's a picture of what it looked like. It was quite an impressive building and impressive grounds, the insane asylum. And that was burnt down a few years ago, just that front part of it. And we'll go to the next slide. And that's what it looks like today. Everything they just let it go. It's all deteriorating. Windows are all, a lot of them you can see are smashed in. It's all overgrown. They've got this huge fence, probably 12 to 15 feet high, all the way around the whole property, so nobody can get in there. And that's all. It's completely discontinued today. And we'll go to the next slide. Now, the prosecution, what they requested, special autopsies. And those are the two attorneys, Hosea Knowlton and William Moody. And William Moody was a young fellow, very aggressive, really wanted to make a name for himself. And I looked him up, and they said later he became a justice at the United States Supreme Court. And this is one of the cases where he was going to make his name. So he had an unusual request for the special autopsies. So we'll go to the next slide. And the bodies of Andrew and Abby were taken to Oak Grove Cemetery in Fall River. There's a famous arch entrance where you go through. And if you take a look over on just to the left of that arch, there's a small building there. And it's some sort of a crypt where the bodies were temporarily put until they, would inter them in the cemetery. And that's where Abby and Andrew were placed. And Dr. William Dolan, who we mentioned, did the first preliminary autopsy. He was there, and the attorney said, here's what we want you to do. Now, this sounds almost something like one of these unbelievable Halloween stories you see in the movies there, but this is what actually was done. The attorneys had him remove the heads of both of the bodies. And what they did is they had them boil them in hot water to remove all the flesh, and they wanted just the skeleton heads for forensic evidence for the trial. That's quite an interesting thing, and that's what William Moody wanted, and he was one of these days, or in a few years, to become one of the justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. Very aggressive. So we'll go to the next picture. Now, Lizzie leaves the jail, and once again, she goes on the Taunton Railroad Station. And we'll go to the next slide. This is 10 months later, and she goes from the Taunton jail to the Bedford jail, which is 20 miles southeast of where the Taunton jail was. And that's where the trial, Superior Court, Massachusetts, that's where it's going to be held. And we'll go to the next picture. Once again, is the map. Now you can see Fall River in a 10-mile trip to Taunton jail, where she stayed for 10 months. And then she took the train, which is about 20 miles from Taunton all the way down to New Bedford. And we'll go to the next picture. And this is a great picture. This is the picture 1892. Of the New Bedford Railroad Station. So that's where she is now. She's in New Bedford. And she's getting really nervous now. Her trial date is already set. She left the Taunton jail, and here she is now in New Bedford. And we'll go to the next slide. And she was kept at the Ash Street Jail in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And that's the picture of it. That's what it looked like back in the day. And that's only can't be any more than a quarter mile away from the Supreme Court. And that's where they held all the prisoners. And so took some pictures of this when I visited there a couple months ago. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's where she awaited trial, at the Ash Street Jail. And that's an excellent picture of what it'll look like. It's got the small fence in the front. You can see all the bars on the windows. That's where they held all the prisoners awaiting trial at the Superior Court in New Bedford. And we'll go to the next picture. And I took that one. That's the Ash Street Jail today. So it's still there, and it's still in operation. You can still get all the bars and all the windows. And that's where Lizzie Borden was held for a few days before she actually had her trial. And we'll go to the next picture. I always like to do this. I put put two of them side by side as close as I can, and you can see that's what it looked like on the left in 1893, and what it looked like over there on the right in 2015. And she must have been really getting nervous now, and of course her attorneys were there with her. She was given instructions when she did go to trial not to say anything. They were going to handle it. And apparently that really bothered her, because she wanted to, in her defense, proclaim her innocence. But they told her, no, when we go to trial, you will not show any emotion. We will handle your case. And that's the way they were going to do it. And of course, it cost a fortune. It was like a dream team of attorneys. I mean, they had the top attorneys in Massachusetts, and the other gentleman there, Attorney Moody, was almost going to ultimately ended up on the Supreme Court. One of the other attorneys for was the former governor of the state of Massachusetts, so she had the best legal help you could possibly get. So we'll go to the next picture. And her defense lawyer was Andrew Jennings, and he was the family's lawyer for many years. And he was actually lived in Fall River, near probably a block away from up on the French Street area in Fall River. Block away from where Lizzie's going to live eventually when she moves. That's kind of the area, what they call up on the hill. And we'll go to the next picture. And that's his house. I found that. And that's well kept. You can see that. And that's Andrew Jennings' house. That was her defense, one of her defense attorneys. And you can see whether that's quite an estate, quite a house in Fall River. And we'll go to the next picture. And this is actually a postcard, and it came out pretty good. The New Bedford Superior Court. You can see the court right in the middle there, and there's old houses on the left, and that house is no longer there. It's a parking lot, and this court is still in operation today. And that's a great thing, because back then, people didn't have any color photography, and they relied a lot on these colored postcards. They thought that was the big thing back then. And the picture came out really, really good for history in this program. So we'll go to the next slide. And that's what it looks like today, which I took. And of course, I make my comparisons like I enjoy doing. So we'll go to the next slide. And you can see in 1893 on the left, that's what the building looked like. And in 2015, on the right, that's what it looks like. So that's still there today, the famous courthouse in New Bedford, where Lizzie Borden had her trial. And that's extremely important for the history of, certainly of Massachusetts. And we'll go to the next picture. And that's the actual courtroom, what it'll look like, where Lizzie had her trial. And that's one of the famous pictures there. And no, I haven't been in the courtroom. Every time I get jury duty, I end up in Taunton. But maybe one of these days I'll get picked to go on a jury in New Bedford. And so this next week we'll be getting into, or in a couple of weeks we'll be getting into part 4. But I have a few items I just want to hold up here. One here, if you're interested, this just came out. This was a famous movie, TV movie, Elizabeth Montgomery, The Legend of Lizzie Borden. And really, it's one of the best movies conducted. It had a lot of the courtroom drama. And since I did all the research, all the, a lot of the, what the characters say, whatever, is exactly from the court transcripts. So this was done very well. This was done quite a few years ago, and just recently it's available on DVD. And they also had, my daughter got me this book called Sisterly Love, and it just came out 2 years ago, Jordan Bollinger. What he did is he took all the facts of the Lizzie Borden case of the two sisters, and he used those as the basis for this novel. And he embellished it, and if you read this book it's about the two sisters, Lizzie and Emma, you feel like you're right there in Fall River, right there in the Taunton jail. It's very dramatic. He did quite a good job in this book, and this is a recent one. It's a different approach to the whole Lizzie Borden case, and there's a lot to it. In our next episode, we're going to be covering the trial, and you can see how interesting that's going to turn out. So once again, this is Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and you can't get any more New England as the story of Lizzie Borden and the actual places where she went to school, where she was at the courtroom, the different jails, whatever. It's quite a bit of one of the most famous murders in the United States history, and it's quite a story to have, and especially with those what they call the dream team attorneys that they had, and the transcripts of the trial is really fascinating to see how they approach this story. So once again, it's Dave Norton from Discovering New England History, and have a good afternoon.